In the Bible's final book, Revelation, there's a number that has fascinated and, let's be honest, confused people for centuries. It describes this sealed, holy army right at the heart of the apocalypse. And to really get what it means, we've got to dig a little deeper, follow the clues hidden in its ancient world, just like scholars do, to solve one of Revelation's biggest puzzles.
So what's the big deal? Well, the number is 144,000. Revelation chapter 7 tells us there are 12,000 people sealed from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. They're basically God's special forces, protected through all the final judgments. But who are they really? Is this a literal head count, or is something more symbolic going on here?
To get to the bottom of this, we're going to approach it like a detective story, because the answer isn't just sitting there on the surface. Scholars suggest it's actually hidden in three really important clues that an ancient reader would have picked up on immediately. So let's start our investigation. Okay, our first clue. It comes from a little later in the book, Revelation chapter 14, and it gives this very specific and kind of strange description of who these 144,000 people are. They're male virgins who haven't defiled themselves with women. Now, hold on, because this is where it gets weird. For anyone in that ancient Israelite world, this detail would have seemed totally out of left field. I mean, priests in Israel could get married. That was normal. So why this super specific mention of virginity? Right? That kind of specific language tells you the author, John, is making a deliberate point. This isn't just a random detail. He's setting up a contrast. This description is meant to be a counterpoint to another, much darker story that everyone at the time would have known. A story about divine beings who did the exact opposite. And that brings us to the Watchers. In super popular ancient Jewish books like 1 Enoch, the Watchers were these divine beings, the sons of God, from Genesis 6, who totally abandoned their post in heaven. And what was their great sin? They came down to earth and, you guessed it, defiled themselves with human women, unleashing all kinds of chaos and corruption. And when you put the two side by side, it just clicks. Scholars argue that the 144,000 are set up as the perfect mirror opposition to the Watchers. You see it, right? The Watchers fell from heaven. The 144,000 stand on the heavenly Mount Zion. The Watchers were corrupt. The 144,000 are blameless. And the big one, the Watchers defiled themselves with women, while the 144,000 are pure virgins. They are the faithful ones who reverse that ancient cosmic rebellion. All right, let's move on to our second clue. This one takes us back to that original list of tribes in Revelation 7. And it's a classic case of it's not what's there, but what's not there that really matters. So here are the 12 tribes that make up the 144,000. But if you know your Old Testament, you'll spot it right away. A major player is missing. The tribe of Dan is completely gone from the list. And this isn't just some typo. It's a very deliberate choice that even had the early church fathers scratching their heads. So why give Dan the boot? Well, throughout the Old Testament, the tribe of Dan has let's say, a checkered history. Way back in Genesis, the patriarch Jacob prophesies that Dan would be a serpent in the way. Later, the whole tribe goes rogue and sets up an idolatrous cult. And they're even linked geographically to a place called Bashan, which had all these associations with demonic, evil powers. So you take all that, the serpent reputation, the history of rebellion, and it led early Christian thinkers, like a guy named Irenaeus in the 2nd century, to a pretty wild conclusion. They developed this tradition that the great enemy of the end times, the Antichrist himself, would actually come from the tribe of Dan. So its omission from the list wasn't just a punishment, it was a dark prophecy. Okay, but hang on a second. This creates a puzzle, right? Because the New Testament and the Old Testament sources it pulls from, like the Book of Daniel, they all paint the final enemy as a Gentile, an outsider, a non-Jew. So how could he possibly come from a Jewish tribe like Dan? Well, this is where ancient history gets really cool. Some scholars have a theory. They point to evidence that the original Israelite tribe of Dan might have been taken over or absorbed by a Gentile group of raiders known as the Sea Peoples, specifically a tribe called the Denyen. If that's true, then Dan becomes this fascinating hybrid, a tribe with Jewish roots that effectively became Gentile, perfectly blending the two identities needed for the Antichrist tradition. What a twist, right? All right, 2 clues down, 1 to go. Our third and final clue is all about re-examining a famous phrase from Revelation 7. It's a phrase everyone thinks they know, but its original meaning has gotten a little lost over time. It's about what these people have gone through. We're talking about the Great Tribulation. Now, when most people hear that today, their minds immediately jump to a specific 7-year period of chaos, often linked to the Book of Daniel. But
If you go back and look at the Old Testament source for that idea, you find something a little different. You find a period of intense, one-of-a-kind trouble, but with no specific time limit attached.
Here it is, the key passage from Daniel 12. Listen to the language. It talks about a time of trouble that is worse than anything that has ever happened before. And it ends with God's people being delivered. It's all about the intensity of the suffering, not the duration.
And here's the bottom line. Nowhere in the Bible is the phrase Great Tribulation explicitly tied to a 7-year period or the 70th week of Daniel. That connection is an interpretation, a theological system built around the text, but it's not actually in the text itself. The original idea was about facing an unparalleled time of trial and staying faithful no matter how long it lasted. So, what have we learned from our 3 clues? This isn't just about solving a single puzzle. It's about discovering a whole new way to read the Book of Revelation, to see it in its original, ancient context. The method is actually pretty simple, but it's incredibly powerful. First, you find a weird detail that doesn't seem to fit. Then, you trace that idea back to its roots in the Old Testament. And finally, you look at other writings from that same time period to see how people were thinking about these ideas. Suddenly, you start to see the text through first-century eyes. So in the end, the identity of the 144,000 isn't a simple who or when. The real revelation is understanding how the author wove together all these ancient threads, stories of fallen angels, cursed tribes, and epic trials, to create this powerful and layered message about what it means to be faithful, even when faced with cosmic evil. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If there's this much history and theology packed into just one single number, what other ancient stories and profound ideas are still out there, just waiting to be discovered, hidden in plain sight in these incredible old texts?